Watch this.
The clock continues to click on the federal government shutdown. But when you click on a federal government website these days, should you expect information or partisan politics?
Every day that Senate Democrats continue opposing a clean funding bill.
He was a late addition to one of Idaho's highest profile murder cases, and even he was surprised by a plea deal. Josh Hurwitz explains how that came to be and what he's up to now. The fight to save Redfish Lake Lodge last summer wasn't just dramatic, it was expensive. Planes, pumps, and backburns all paid for with federal dollars. We're going to take a look at what would happen if that responsibility ever falls to Idaho.
Senate Democrats voted to block a clean federal funding bill, H.R. 5371, leading to a government shutdown that is preventing the U.S. Small Business Administration from serving America's 36 million small businesses.
Almost immediately following the failed vote to pass a federal budget bill and the subsequent shutting down of the government at midnight Tuesday, messages started popping up on government websites and, as you heard, on outgoing messages. Most began with the same opening line, quote, "The radical left Democrats shut down the government," end quote. And depending on which side of the aisle you stand, that statement either tracks or is wildly untrue. But the broader discussion might be, do these postings and messages violate the Hatch Act? The Hatch Act was passed in 1939, born out of the New Deal, when Works Progress Administration employees were getting pressured into working on campaigns of FDR political allies. You like the job the government just created for you? Well, how about you start showing it? It's kind of the sentiment. So a New Mexico Democrat, Senator Carl Hatch, came up with some rules for federal employees to limit political activities while on the job. The point is to ensure federal programs are run in a nonpartisan fashion. Senator Hatch called it an act to prevent pernicious activities. And the Oxford Dictionary defines pernicious as having a harmful effect, especially in a gradual or subtle way. Well, there's been nothing subtle about what we've seen on several government websites the past couple of days.
Every day that Senate Democrats continue opposing a clean funding bill.
From the Small Business Administration to the Department of Housing and Urban Development to the Justice Department, government websites are putting the blame for the government shutdown on one political party.
The spirit of the law is that you shouldn't be mixing sort of overtly political or partisan advocacy in your speech with your official capacity as a member of the United States government.
The Hatch Act applies to people and agencies, according to Boise State political science professor Dr. Charles Hunt.
It's not often that folks are, really taken to task or overtly fired or something for violating the Hatch Act. It's usually just kind of a slap on the wrist.
Enacted in 1939,
those slaps on the wrist are supposed to be handed down by the Office of the Special Counsel
in order to preserve the nonpartisan administration of federal programs.
An investigative agency of the federal government that's supposed to be independent.
I mean, one of the issues that we're sort of facing this time is that the head of the Office of the Special Counsel was dismissed by President Trump earlier this term and has been replaced with an ally of his. That's one area where you might say, okay, Trump is, and the administration is not likely to get in trouble for any of these recent violations.
That's assuming they are a violation. Have you seen some of the things that have been posted on these agencies' websites?
Yes. Some of these more explicit blaming of Democrats in Congress specifically.
The Housing and Urban Development. The radical left in Congress shut down the government. HUD will use available resources to help Americans in need.
Right.
The DOJ. Democrats have shut down the government. Department of Justice websites are not currently regularly updated. The Forest Service. The radical left Democrats shut down the government. The USDA, due to the radical left Democrat shutdown. The CDC. Mission-critical activities will continue during the Democrat-led government shutdown. And this from the Boise office of the SBA.
Every day that Senate Democrats continue opposing a clean funding bill, they are stopping an estimated 320 small businesses from accessing $170 million in SBA guaranteed funding.
And as soon as the shutdown is over, we are prepared to immediately return to the record-breaking services we were providing under the leadership of the Trump administration.
All right, there you have it.
What do you think of that?
I have a couple of reactions. I mean, number one is that it's, they say Senate Democrats. A Republican, Rand Paul, also voted against the continuation of the spending bill. So aside from not technically being correct, that's, to me, that's something that at the very least gets right up to the line of what the Hatch Act, of what would be a violation of the Hatch Act. The inclusion of the party label, I think, is the potential big problem there.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the Hatch Act is supposed to ensure federal programs
Yeah.
are administered in a nonpartisan way.
That's the ultimate spirit of the law. Part of the purpose of it is to instill trust that the government is serving all Americans equally and that they are seeing the entirety of the country as their constituency. If you put out a message like that, it is not likely to instill confidence among Americans who, say, don't support Donald Trump, that the SBA is going to be looking out for their interests, right? And so that's another purpose of the law, is to make sure that Americans feel that trust from the federal government.
So right up to the line, according to Dr. Hunt, but maybe not crossing it. Naming the Democrats may not be a violation, but putting the blame directly on them, well, that could be. Several national news sources have reported the SBA and the Department of Labor issued suggested out-of-office reply emails for those furloughed employees that put the blame on the Senate Democrats for the shutdown. But at least they were given, those employees, they were given the option to use it or not. According to NBC News, Department of Education employees had their automatic replies manipulated without their permission. Hatch Act violations have been issued a few times over the past few administrations, like the warning issued to President Biden's press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, and the OSC recommending Kellyanne Conway be fired in Trump's first term for violating the Hatch Act dozens of times. A Hatch Act complaint has been filed, by the way, this week by watchdog group Public Citizen. But as you heard Dr. Hunt say, any investigation or prosecution is at the discretion of the Office of the Special Counsel. And based on what he's seen over the last 9 to 10 months, Dr. Hunt says this administration has shown they're not really keen on bowing to public pressure. A familiar face in Idaho's legal community will be sticking around a little longer in the Gem State. Former U.S. Attorney for Idaho Josh Hurwitz has joined Boise's branch of Holland and Hart because of what he calls, quote, a commitment to giving back to the Treasure Valley. Well, you may recognize the name and maybe the face because he's been involved in some pretty big cases, both as a U.S. attorney and a special prosecutor. Here's Joe Paris.
For years, Josh Hurwitz led pursuits of justice across Idaho, elevating to U.S. attorney from 2022 to 2025. In a traditional move, he left the office as a new administration took over the federal government earlier this year, but still finds himself committed to the Gem State.
Everything that we're seeing in our communities, from economic growth to preserving resources for future generations. And for me, it's a great fit, I think, for the next phase of my career to serve Idaho clients and seek justice in new ways.
Thinking back to your time as U.S. attorney, some time has passed now.
Yeah.
Does it feel different than when you first left the job? Have you had time to kind of reflect on that experience?
I think we talked, pretty quickly after I resigned, and it was, overwhelming feeling of gratitude. And that hasn't changed. I know that the folks in the U.S. Attorney's Office here still manning the ship, doing great work, keeping our communities safe. And I'm forever grateful I got to participate in that mission and lead the office.
Hurwitz planned to take some time off to recharge, but shortly after leaving the U.S. Attorney's Office, he received a call to pursue justice on the most talked about case across Idaho and possibly the country, an offer to be a special prosecutor on the Moscow murders trial.
I got a call from Bill Thompson, the lead prosecutor on the Kohberger case, and said, hey, we're going to trial. We know your experience, we know your skill set. Would you join us in taking this case to trial and seeking justice? And, I'd obviously been aware of the case and somewhat involved in supporting the FBI and its work in the case. And just being an Idahoan now, recognizing the significance of the case, for me, it was an easy yes to jump on that and dedicate myself to that.
What was your role as a part of that team?
Yeah, so I was one of 3 trial attorneys. So we were preparing to take it to trial, preparing our opening statement, preparing jury selection. I think we were going to have about 100 witnesses, and a third of those were going to be mine. So I was preparing like I did when I was a federal prosecutor, getting cases.
But the trial never happened. In a surprise move to many, Bryan Kohberger made a plea deal. What was your reaction like when, I guess, you found out from the defense that, okay, we're gonna make a deal here?
Yeah, I was surprised that there was that interest from the defense, given, both my mindset of, I'm joining this team to be in trial in court for, 3 to 4 months, and also just that he had never shown any indication of even considering admitting to what he did, and then something changed, and so it was surprising.
Avoiding trial and the possibility of the death penalty was met with mixed reactions from victims' families and community commentary.
And we understand, the debate about that, and that there are different reasonable opinions on that. For us, I think what it came down to ultimately was the finality for the victims' families, most of whom wanted this resolution the way it turned out. They don't have to go through a painful trial, a lengthy, painful trial. They don't have to go through decades of appeals and get re-traumatized every time there's a new court filing or new court hearing. As you probably know, in the death penalty here in Idaho, we have folks on death row that have been there for 4 decades, 40 years. And every time there's a hearing, those families get notified. They have the opportunity to go to court. They, in some sense, have to relive the trauma. And so for us, thinking long term, the finality of the resolution that was reached, it was not an easy decision. We would much prefer that everyone agreed with it, but recognizing that reasonable minds were going to disagree, that was still the best outcome to give people finality, peace of mind that he will not be ever out walking the streets, and that, as you said, people can, and the community can move forward and heal to the extent possible.
And another interesting perspective that Josh kind of filled me in on, I hadn't really thought about it, Brian, is the case itself, and it was held here again at the Ada County Courthouse. It has an impact on everybody from the prosecutors, the victims' families, of course, but you don't really think about, the administrators, the people that happen just to be around it in the offices that we would never know the names of and their involvement in.
Right.
And it weighs heavy on people, this type of the Moscow murders case. So it's just an added reminder of, I guess, the impact that this entire thing had, impacting real lives here in the Treasure Valley, something that I think was lost in, of course, in the international narrative that was, just about this terrible, terrible crime.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Joe. It's easy to see what wildfires do to Idaho's landscape, the ash, the torched trees, the blackened hillsides, but sometimes they also highlight what is lying just below the surface. And that would be the debate over who should manage Idaho's land. Could the state do a better job than the feds? Well, that depends on how much Idaho taxpayers want to spend, because fighting fires and then rehabbing the land, it's not cheap. It's a concept that is still fresh on the ground and in the minds of those who lived through one of Idaho's biggest summer wildfires last year. Hunter Funk takes us to Redfish Lake, where a spark, a crash, and a massive response left lessons Idaho can't afford to ignore.
You just heard from stakeholders about how difficult it would be to manage state and federal lands within our borders. But what does this specifically mean when it comes to wildfires and fire mitigation? We drove more than 100 miles away from here over to Stanley and looked back at the 2024 wildfire season. How was it handled? What did they learn? And what would this look like if it was in the state's hands to handle it?
Last year on a beautiful day, July 12th, all of a sudden a puff of smoke came up across the lake here at the Bench Lakes.
For Redfish Lake Lodge owners Jeff and Audra Clegg,
It just started to escalate, and there was a helicopter crew that came in. The helicopter unfortunately crashed in the lake, and they had to kind of revamp. And the next day, the Forest Service, because of what was going on, contacted us and said we need to evacuate everybody. So we spent better part of the day trying to get all the guests off the lake, off the beach.
what unfolded for the next 16 days during their busiest season changed everything. They had to relocate about 100 employees.
It became a really dramatic event. There was just 3 or 4 of us in here, and then all the Forest Service firefighting crew came in.
Fire crews poured in across the west, bringing planes, sprinklers, pumps, and started backburning, giving everything they had to protect the lodge and stop the fire.
Congressman Simpson pulled Audra and I aside and said to us, if we lose Redfish Lake Lodge, it's not because we didn't give it everything we have. And they did. I mean, they literally unleashed all of their facilities.
We felt protected.
Yeah.
We really did feel protected.
But behind this fire line was federal crews, federal dollars, and federal laws. And hypothetically, if these lands were to be handed over to the state, people like Justin Hayes with the Idaho Conservation League say it would come with a price tag that the state isn't ready for.
The state could just never take over that responsibility. If somehow these lands became state lands, the firefighting bill would be about $150 million a year that the state would have to cough up.
Hayes says that would likely come back to the taxpayers.
Communities across Idaho are annually passing levies and bonds trying to pay for the school system around them. What do you think, you're going to have like a levy and a bond to support what was once the national forest but is now a state? No, it's just not going to happen.
He says that dollar figure doesn't even include the cost of fire mitigation. Things like prescribed burns, forest thinning, and building fire breaks to protect communities before a fire starts.
There's a lot of demands put on it, and so it's a lot harder to manage. And the state management framework's just very different. It's much more, we're here to make money, we're doing this one thing. They're not balancing as many competing demands.
Fire mitigation comes with a lot of red tape. Jeff Beeler spent years defending federal agencies in court.
Throughout the West, we've seen some of the most severe fires we've ever experienced.
When you look at the time before a fire starts, Beeler says even small projects like thinning trees require layers of environmental review that slow it down.
The federal government, in order to approve that project, would have to go through a process under the National Environmental Policy Act. It just sort of requires agencies to engage in well-informed decision-making. They have to notify the public, they have to explain the scope of the project, allow for public commentary, and then they need to make sure that they're engaging in sort of the environmental analysis that they need to conduct. It's not easy for the federal government to comply with these statutes. There are regulations that are involved. I mean, it takes time for that to occur.
He says it can take years, even after a priority location is established, to begin the project. And no matter if it's the state or federal government, they have to go through that procedure, and many end up in a court battle from environmental groups, adding to the cost.
It would require a level of investment and a level of management that the state thus far, has not done, right? We've relied primarily on the federal government because it's federal government land. It would be difficult if all of the land were given to the state of Idaho, for example.
Designated wilderness areas are even more difficult to get an approved fire mitigation plan. It's an effort, he says, the federal government takes seriously.
If the forest is not being managed, trees are not being cut down, and there are these massive wildfires, lives could be lost, firefighters could be killed. I mean, there are a number of consequences for that.
Work that Hayes believes the state of Idaho wouldn't want to take on for the added responsibility and cost.
The state of Idaho has a track record of selling lots of land. I mean, 41%, 42% of all the land they've ever owned, they've already sold into private hands. And so if somehow they became the landlords, the owners of the Boise National Forest, they couldn't afford to manage it. And so they would find the parts that they wanted to manage for timber production, and they would sell off the parts that they didn't think were economical to them.
For Redfish Lake Lodge owners, it all comes back to gratitude for the amount of help that stepped in.
We felt a lot of support from the firefighters and the Forest Service during all of that. The communications were excellent. We were, informed all along the way. We attended all the community meetings, and they did an outstanding job of protecting all of our facilities.
And it's the reason they can continue running the iconic lodge today.
We're just so grateful. Everything is here and everything is good. Yeah. We're so grateful.
Well, coming up tomorrow, we have the final installment of our Public Lands special, Beyond Growth. How do cities grow when the land next door is off limits for development? Because, well, obviously it's owned by the government. Or how do they expand? We're headed to Stanley to learn more about that. And if you missed any of these stories in this series this week, or just want to watch tomorrow's segment right now, you can watch the entire special on KTVB+.
Well, the sunshine we enjoyed earlier across the Boise area has been replaced by cloud cover, and soon it will be replaced by rain. We have a soggy setup coming in overnight as early as dinner time, 6 o'clock or so. So over the next hour or so, the rain will arrive in the Treasure Valley. And look at this, set to continue all through the night into the early morning hours of tomorrow. We do have first alert weather conditions in place overnight into about 7 o'clock tomorrow morning for the potential of nearly an inch of rain in Boise over the next 12 to 24 hours. hours or so. You can see the very defined band of precipitation stretching from across the Treasure Valley up into the Boise and West Central Mountains, where flash flood watches are in place for the possibility of mudslides and debris flows. Cloudy tomorrow, much cooler behind the front that's going to trigger that rain overnight tonight. We'll land in just the low 60s with breezy winds in the Treasure Valley tomorrow. Breezy winds linger on Saturday, but we do dry up a bit. We hover in those 60s, though, with sunshine returning all the way into early next week.
Oh, Bruce reminding us today that Trump couldn't care less about violating the Hatch Act or any other act because, well, SCOTUS gave him that power. Meanwhile, we all have blind spots when it comes to politics, says Paul. However, it's cringy to watch and listen to Republicans and the don't tread on me crowd excuse behavior they morally don't agree with. And finally, let's end with this one today. Aren't we as a collective sick and tired of the us versus them the administration is trying to put us in? Enough is enough. This affects all of us. Whomever you believe is at fault. It doesn't matter. What matters is getting it resolved. It is unhelpful and immature to continue to point fingers. Just fix it. Just solve it. Day 2, continuing into day 3. And we'll be back here tomorrow.
Continue with us and watch free now on the KTVB Plus app everywhere you stream.